use generative AI, what generative AI might be most useful for from my perspective. I do think we have seen applications of AI for things like drug discovery that have indeed been transformative. I mean, AlphaFold won a Nobel Prize this year. You might argue that it's a bit too soon for something like AlphaFold because it hasn't really sort of impacted people at the same level as, say, mRNA vaccines. But it is clear that it has led to an increase in the sorts of useful drugs that are in trial right now. And I'm quite excited about the potential use of AI for drug discovery.
So you focus a lot on, but you give a lot of examples of generative AI. I think generative AI is something that we all agree is, quote unquote AI, right? But how do you distinguish between something like AI and predictive analytics? So in a lot of industries like insurance and in medicine, they've relied on database insights and data science for decision-making in years. Insurance is a great example of that. You can go back hundreds of years and find examples of people using data science in the insurance industry. So it seems like we tend to use the term AI in situations where we see negative outcomes, but maybe that's not giving AI a fair shake. Do you think that sort of characterization of when we tend to use the term AI is reasonable?
Absolutely. I do think, like AI is whatever hasn't been done yet. And so I do think the definition quite literally applies to many of the things that we call AI today. And one of the reasons that, something like a regression model can be called AI, or we call it AI in our book, is simply because it is branded as AI by the people who are selling it. And so companies like HireVue or Retorio say that AI is what is sort of driving these winning factors in job candidates. AI is what is identifying who is at most risk of healthcare issues and prioritizing them on that basis. And so I think in some sense, we are sort of taking these developers' claims and analyzing them critically. That said, I do think there is one difference between what we're calling predictive AI and what I think a lot of industries have called predictive analytics, in that predictive AI is often at the level of individuals. It is making a claim about an individual person's future and making a decision on that specific basis. Whereas for predictive analytics, it's often at a more coarse granularity. So for an insurance company, it might be the actuarial tables that look at how have people of the similar age who own this car done in the past. It has no claims about whether this individual person will have something happen to them in the future. And that, I think, rests on more sketchy grounds when it comes to how effective it can be.
Mm-hmm. So changing gears a little bit, you also mentioned your book discusses existential risk. And it's actually one of my favorite chapters in the book is actually on the chapter on existential risk. So your book offers a nice antidote to some of the existential risk obsessions that I see. And your argument is that, it's difficult, especially when X-risk discussions are focused on essentially potentially made up claims about what might happen in the future. It's very difficult to debunk those claims because how do you debunk non-factual claims with facts, right? It's a very difficult thing to do in general. The antidote offered in your book is rather than trying to debunk any specific claims, you just argue that a lot of these X-risk studies are futurism and they're not science, right? And so they should be treated differently than you would treat a scientific claim. Futurist predictions, you guys argue, tend to be wrong, or at least unfounded. And so we just shouldn't be taking those kinds of claims as seriously as we would take a scientific claim. I think, is that a reasonable way to characterize what you guys said? But still, X-risk tends to be sort of persistent in the media for whatever reason. Maybe it gets clicks, maybe it's just a convenient narrative that corporations can use to distract regulators. But I guess my question is, what do you think scientific thinkers and academics can do to make sure that scientific voices get heard in these sorts of discussions, or that policy discussions tend to focus on realistic issues?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. So I think one thing I should point out at the beginning is, in some sense, the X-risk view of the world, even though it is based on like futuristic risks that we have no evidence for, is a self-consistent model of the world. To some extent, it offers like a coherent view of thinking about the world. And I think what we're very much trying to do in the book is to offer this alternative coherent vision of the world. Because I think oftentimes as a community, you sort of responded to the individual claims made by people in the AI safety community, for instance, who think that X risk is extremely likely. But I think what we also need to do is like articulate this alternative vision for how AI safety can be handled. And so when we talk about, shoring up our defenses on cyber risks and improving our biological screening methods to prevent against bioweapon attacks, I think we're trying to do like part of that as well. But then when we come to like what scientists should do, I think one thing that we are seeing increasingly over and over is the shift to evidence-based policymaking. And we have to keep stressing that, it's fine if we disagree on what AI will end up doing, but we can agree on what the evidence is today. And I think having like a very clear-eyed view on what the evidence is today can be a very helpful way of doing this. So maybe I can give an example. So in 2023, when the Biden-Harris administration released their executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy AI, one of the sections of that executive order focused on foundation models with openly available model weights. And I think it tasked the NTIA to come up with a report on how these models should be regulated. And I think at the time, the state of the evidence was that we had seen a couple of studies, actually 2 of them from MIT, that claimed that open foundation models could be used to create bioweapons. And one of the studies even claimed that the next pandemic could be caused by an openly released large language model. And I think this is like an astonishing claim. So if this is serious, we should sort of spend some time investigating this. But what we found over the course of the next few months was that all of these supposedly harmful claims about AI or like compounds generated using AI could actually also be found by a simple Wikipedia search. And so if you can find that same information on Wikipedia, then AI is not really the factor that is causing this increase in risk. And so we came up with this sort of way to characterize this, which we call the marginal risk of AI over and above the existing risks of other types of technologies, like web search on the internet or Wikipedia or what have you. And we sort of wrote this in a letter to the NTIA in our response to the NTIA. And I think it was well taken in the sense that when the NTIA released its later report this July, they did address the fact that, currently we have zero evidence of marginal risks. We should be cautious. We should keep collecting evidence on what these marginal risks are. But rather than saying that, because open models can be used to do some type of harm, we should ban them, they actually did resort to this evidence-based approach. And I think this is what we need to be doing a lot more of. It's not enough to sort of figure out what the existing risks of AI are, but we also have to keep communicating with policymakers who are looking at these risks seriously. And I think that's like a good way of, or we'll have a good chance of sort of making the evidence the primary factor in policymaking that way.
Maybe you can clarify, well, what do you mean? You talk about self-consistent views of the world. Maybe you can clarify a little bit what you mean by that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, for the longest time, I could not wrap my head around the fact that someone could potentially believe that, AI is literally going to kill us all, for instance, and yet work at a leading company that is building advanced AI, like Anthropic. But then I think I was sort of talking to people from these companies, talking to people who held different views from myself. And I realized that actually it is a self-consistent model in some sense. There is no contradiction between working at Anthropic and believing advanced AI can kill us all. Because if you do believe that advanced AI would have the capability to sort of control the world's resources and actually have the power to make these catastrophic risks more likely, then you want it to be on your side. And so that is the worldview that people are coming from when they're talking about, working at leading AGI labs and yet thinking AI will kill us all. There were other contradictions as well that I've seen play over and over, but which I have since reconciled. So one example is a lot of the people working within these communities tend to think that we need to maximize the benefits, the greatest benefits for the largest number of people. So in particular, this is the effective altruism community, but more broadly, it is the sphere of utilitarianism. And at the same time, are arguing for policies that will fund more and more AI development rather than prioritizing something like malaria nets or the typical effective altruism causes over the last 2 decades. And once again, this used to be a contradiction in terms for me. But once I sort of realized that people actually genuinely believe that, AI is, I don't know, 60% likely to kill us all within the next 10 years, then this becomes a lot more palatable. It's not just like a number that is sort of being thrown around by people. A lot of people in the community generally do believe that this is the likely outcome. And if you think that is indeed true, then I don't think it is a contradiction to sort of prioritize AI safety over everything else, to sort of stop doing social activities, stop reading books, stop engaging with anyone, stop doing science, and just spend all of your time thinking about AI X risk. And I think this was sort of the vision that I see. In some cases, it is sort of implicit. In other cases, people have made it explicit. But this is sort of the vision that I see powering the AI safety community, the X-risk branch of AI safety community, people who are extremely worried about the existential risks to humanity. And so to respond to this like worldview, I don't think it is enough to counter specific facts or to counter specific fallacies made by this worldview. I think we have to offer something that is an alternative vision of how AI safety might proceed. So for instance, by looking at AI as a normal technology, even if it is transformative like the internet or electricity, but if we can show evidence that AI is transformative and yet it is not sentient, that investing in defenses would help regardless of whether you believe that X risks are real. So this is the sort of alternative that we need to provide as a community. It's not enough to just counter individual facts that are coming out of this community. It's important to counter them at the level of epistemology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could offer a less generous characterization of self-consistency, which could also just be that these views are often self-consistent and that it makes the same people money, right? Like you can believe that AI should be developed quickly within your own organization, but then believe that there should be legal frameworks that prevent there from being open source models that you have to compete with, right? You'll see people advocate for regulation, but then oppose regulation when it creates financial liabilities for their own companies, right? And there is a self-consistency here, right? But it might not be a philosophical or intellectual self-consistency.
Absolutely. And I think that's especially true when it comes to like the higher echelons of the companies. Altman in May 2023 argued in front of the Senate that we need more regulation in the form of licensing other income, or so that there are no other incumbents.
Right. So your book talks about the value of regulation, but one thing I didn't notice looking at the book, but didn't have a chance to go through it line by line, but I didn't see any specific calls for action or any particular policy prescriptions. Is there a reason you chose to sort of stay away from this? Maybe just because maybe the book was not meant to address a particular moment in time. Maybe it was. But is there a particular policy or regulation that you would like to see enacted soon?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it was in part because when we were editing the book, we sort of went over every single line in the book to make sure it would still be relevant 5 years from today, or at least our best guess of what the world 5 years from today would look like. And so, yes, indeed. I mean, we wanted to give like a somewhat higher level view of what approaches to policymaking exist, which ones we're optimistic about, what we should look out for, but not the specific not propose specific proposals to be implemented in that at that level. That said, actually, we do have some things that might, depending on how you think of it, like might fit the bill of specific policy proposals. So for instance, the book has a chapter or a section on generative AI and training data. And I think this is one of the most contentious issues and surrounding the training of generative AI models. And actually one where we do think we can make some progress, because unlike a lot of other areas, this is one where you have a clear sort of organization or a clear set of people who have something at stake. So we talk about the training data for generative AI image models being excluded on an opt-in basis. So you can opt into excluding your training data, but you're not by default asked to provide consent for your images being used in the training data. And especially for artists, this is a big deal. We talk about the fact that Apple's audiobooks narrators have actually automatically been drafted into providing their voices for training future text-to-speech models. And Apple actually has already launched a feature to automatically create audiobooks for most of the books that are created. I mean, to be clear, I think this is a fantastic piece of technology. It'll improve accessibility for all of the books that cannot be transcribed in this way. But at the same time, I think the way the benefits or the value of this edition would be distributed is unfair, or to some extent unfair, especially to the creators whose voices were taken for the training of these models. And so I think those are the sort of specific issues we do address, where we think you need to have consent and compensation for the workers whose data is being used to train these models. And we actually have a somewhat controversial proposal in there as well, which is about taxing generative AI companies, because the way we usually address negative externalities on society, let's say by the tobacco industry, is by imposing taxes on companies that are creating those negative externalities. And we do think that is very much the case AI companies are in today as well. So these are some of the proposals that might be a bit more concrete. But yeah, in general, I think we sort of try to look at the processes that create these proposals and the reasons for creating these proposals and the approaches, such as whether they have like sector-specific or broad proposals or broad policies, more than we did any specific proposals.
Okay, that's great. We have some questions, and a bunch of people have joined late, so I would urge you to either raise your hand and hopefully I'll see you, or just write your questions in the chat, since we do not have a Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to start with Christabel's question, which is, she writes that the distinction between AI safety and AI fairness has resulted in an unhelpful approach to AI policy. So how do you bridge these two approaches?
That's a great question, and surprisingly controversial question, which it shouldn't be, ideally. So I think the distinctions between safety and fairness have indeed been like a huge topic of controversy within the community over the last year. And, you know, when we started writing the book, I used to see myself fit the AI ethics or AI fairness camp to some extent. But over the last 2 years, what I realized is, in some sense, this is a false dichotomy. So there is indeed like this difference between like the safety and fairness ethics communities for sure. But the fact that we need to prioritize one over the other when it comes to policy, I think has largely, in my view, been incorrect, in the sense that the focus on AI safety has actually led to more and a lot less interest by policymakers on questions of ethics as well. So oftentimes what we'll see is policy staffers or people who are writing the legislation get drawn into the AI safety conversation, but then quickly realize that a lot of the conversation is not focused on things that are actually important to the constituents, things that actually uphold civil rights and so on. And so at least in my view, it has somewhat been a way to also increase the focus. The focus on AI safety has also been a way to increase the focus for arguing for AI ethics-based interventions to policies. We recently saw the AI Civil Rights Act that sort of tries to codify what it means to ensure civil rights with AI-based decisions. And I think it was in part because of this emphasis on AI safety that was brought about by this community. So to some extent, I do think that while, of course, these communities are intellectually distinct, in terms of the impact on policy, it might actually be the case that there is no distinction for a policymaker between these two.
Great, thank you. Tom, did you want to comment on the relationship between AI safety and AI ethics?
I actually like the way the question is posed. You know, if Christabel wants to follow up on that,
she has a different question.
But oh, maybe that's a different question. Okay. But yeah, one of the difficulties is that I think if you look at the way that bias and fairness community tends to approach things like auditing AI systems, I think that there's a perception among okay, so I've heard people that work on AI safety complain that a lot of corporations don't want to be audited for things like bias and fairness, and they just want to stay away from the AI fairness community entirely. And I think that there's a perception among people in industry that people in the AI fairness world are sort of trying to throw them under the bus. and that it's sort of, there's no like positive outcomes from being audited for AI fairness and bias. And people perceive AI fairness studies that way. They're probably right. Generally, you'll oftentimes see papers or studies that are sort of toned in a way that's like, this organization is bad, this organization is doing something wrong. Whereas maybe a better way to pose these kinds of AI fairness studies is that it's a way to make your product better, right? Like if you're say that your job interview tool doesn't suffer from these biases, you can find ways to make the tool more effective. That's especially true for things like the credit industry, right? If you can remove biases from your model, then maybe you're potentially making your model better. But I think that we don't tend to pose AI fairness studies that way. I think tends to be more about shaming and finger pointing than it is about making better products. And I think that has created this sort of false dichotomy between AI safety and AI fairness and bias that doesn't necessarily.
And then whether the law is in effect, non-effect, or enjoined, unknown means.
I think it's
whoever that is, please mute yourself.
restriction, and then the federal
Could
court
you,
may have put
whoever this
or
is,
something.
please mute yourself.
Susan, you can, on the participant panel, you
I can mute all,
anybody.
but then you, okay,
Yeah.
all right. Thank you.
I wanted to quickly respond to Tom's comment because
Yeah.
I mind a very interesting case study. So I think it was folks at Northeastern who got the opportunity to audit a company's product, a hiring automation company's product for bias. I think this was like 3 or 4 years ago at this point. And, they came out with flying colors. If I remember correctly, they had really good scores. There was no bias in the product on many of these sensitive attributes like race or gender or what have you. And to me, actually, this sort of pointed out the opposite problem, which is we are focusing on bias in a product that just does not work at all. So I went in and asked these authors, like, what happened? What was the accuracy of the model in the first place? Like, how well was it predicting someone's future job performance? And they said that the NDA that they signed, or I think the terms of engagement that they signed, prohibited them from even investigating this question. So to me, it's almost the opposite thing for a lot of predictive AI applications, is because you have random number generators essentially at the back, you won't have bias. Like a random number generator is not biased. And by sort of incorporating these AI fairness investigations into their tools, I think companies are sort of sliding that fact under the rug even. So to some extent, when AI fairness communities have been helpful for the industries, I also think they haven't been most effective.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Carolina asks about, she wants to know your take on insurance for the negative effects of AI.
Oh, I think we might have had a follow-up question on the previous discussion.
No, it's not a follow-up. It's a
Okay.
different question. So
Okay.
let me do the moderating of
Sure.
this part. Okay. And I want to give as much people an opportunity to ask questions. So, okay, I will get back to Christabel. Okay, so on insurance, does anyone want to comment on that?
I mean, I think California had this very controversial Senate bill, SB 1047, that passed both houses and was vetoed by the governor. And the bill required AI companies that are developing frontier models to carry out some forms of evaluation and to face certain liabilities if the product did not perform as expected. And this led to a huge debate between people who thought that this would cause regulatory hurdles versus people who believed that this would prevent catastrophic risks of AI. But actually, I think the only party that would benefit most from this type of product would be the insurance providers. So it would be the people who provide insurance to AI companies for the damages they incur under SB 1047. So here's what I mean by that. I mean, the bill looked at types of AI that could cause bioweapons attacks, for instance, or other catastrophic harms. And it had like a section on models that were carved out. But I think the definition of models that were carved out could not, in my view, reasonably carve out 5-year-old models like GPT-2 from the definition. So of course, like GPT-2 would not be a covered model under this bill because it did not satisfy the flops requirement, for instance, but it could absolutely be used to cause the types of harms that the bill was concerned about. And I think that's because AI is a general purpose technology. Asking developers to create an AI system that cannot be used for misuse, such as cybersecurity risks, is like asking a computer manufacturer to create a computer that cannot be used for hacking other people's computers. And so in general, I think that is my view on a lot of these liability type bills that focus on frontier AI companies. When you're trying to regulate general purpose models for dual use harms, then the only winners for the entire sort of space can be these insurance companies. And I don't think that is a meaningful way to address the real risks of AI.
Dokie. We have another question here about how can we ensure that AI development and deployment are aligned with human rights and ethical principles? Ensure is the key word there.
Yeah, this is a tough one, maybe because it's quite broad. So I mean, in some sense, my general view on this would just be like we need regulation on all of like the specific harms that we can think of, but this regulation is often done best at the layers where these harms materialize. So here's an example. We've seen text-to-image models like Stability AI's Stable Diffusion being used to create all sorts of harms in the real world. One that I'm most concerned about is AI-generated non-consensual deepfakes of people that is sexualized imagery created without people's consent. And I think the way people have often gone about this harm is that we need to ban text-to-image models. Now, this might sound like a good idea in theory, like lots of people have proposed this. But I think what people often don't realize is that Stable Diffusion is a 2 GB model. It can fit on a pen drive. It can run on your MacBook, and it can actually even run on your iPhone. And so solutions that try to put the genie back into the bottle are in some sense extremely limited. But there are other levels like the downstream attack surfaces, as they're called in cybersecurity, where we can have this type of regulation. So for instance, Civit AI is this marketplace for AI-generated deepfakes, where you can buy and sell deepfakes of people or models that create deepfakes of people. And I think that is a much more appropriate mechanism. So I'm not sure if we can ensure that AI development and deployment are ethical. I think that's like almost fundamentally impossible by virtue of AI being dual use. But I do think we can do our best attempt at curbing the harms at the places where they actually materialize. I don't know, Tom, if you have any other response to this.
No, I think what you said is reasonable. Yeah.
Okay. Noel asks, what about a regulatory regime where you privatize the risk and socialize the benefits? How do you do that?
Yeah, I'm not sure where to begin with that even. I mean, would that involve something like, the closest I can think of is taxing AI companies so that the costs of these risks are sort of borne by them. But the questions that this question brings to mind immediately for me is how do you incentivize AI companies to do the sort of CapEx that is required for these models? I mean, what this might involve, if we are to think about this seriously, it might be like complete change to the way we organize society as a market and so on. But within like a market-based capitalistic society, I think this is this might be quite hard.
Yeah, in general, I think we sort of rely on the courts to make these sort of decisions, right? Like we hope that there's lawsuits and that the courts make intelligent decisions and set reasonable precedents for where liability should be. You know, one of the things that SB 1047 tried to do was create established liability for language model makers for specific levels of risk, I guess what they would call catastrophic risk, although I think there's some vagueness in what would count as catastrophic. And I think that caused some companies to be quite opposed to the rule. You know, in general, we don't treat generic tools. We tend to I think the courts tend to assign individual responsibility rather than corporate responsibility to certain kinds of uses of tools, right? So if let's say that there's a ransomware incident, we don't sue we don't sue the company that made the laptops that they were using, right? If there's a car accident, there are situations where you can sue the car maker, but for the most part, we tend to assign that responsibility to the driver. Although now with self-driving cars, that whole issue is becoming more complicated, right? And I think right now there's a lot of uncertainty because there haven't been a lot of incidents of liability cases making it through the courts. And so we don't know what the standards are. But I'm pretty sure that we're going to have some standards handed down by the courts within the next few years. And this is something that might not need to be addressed in a statutory way. I think everyone is kind of sprinting right now to create statutes that address this, but I'm not sure that that's actually the right way to do it. I think it might be better to wait and see what shakes out in the courts and then make some reactive choices to sort of fine tune things around the edges. But we'll see where we get in a couple of years.
Do you have thoughts about transparency as a tool to regulate AI? For example, there's the CREATE Act, and California had legislation along those lines that I think passed.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been involved with this effort called the Foundation Model Transparency Index for the last few years. And even without actually relying on regulators, we've seen that transparency has sort of increased over the time that we've been working on this. So this is like a simple scorecard of companies based on how transparent they are on various factors, things like where they collect the data from, what wages they pay the data workers, to all the way to things like that concern the deployment of these models in the real world. So how many users are impacted and what sorts of things users use these models for. In the first version of the index, what we saw was the best company scored a 55 out of 100. So basically, like, in other words, a failing grade. And I think we made the results public. We sort of publicly named the companies and sort of incentivized them to become more transparent in some sense. And in the next version, we saw that the score of every single company improved. Of course, there's still a long way to go. The median score was still a failing grade, but it had improved drastically. And so I think in some sense, it's already meaningful to get transparency gains just by having this sort of public mechanism to disclose the results, to name the winners. And I think this has been a strong culture in AI, is to compete on benchmarks. So if we can make transparency like a benchmark to compete on, then we might get a lot of the way there already. But that said, I do think there are certain factors for which it's very hard to get transparency, especially things where the company's bottom lines would be affected. So for example, disclosing the training data would lead to massive lawsuits from the people whose data was used in the training of these models. In fact, Meta has come out and publicly said that the reason they don't disclose the training data that they use for training their models is specifically legal liability, or the threat of legal liability. And so these are the factors where it's not in the company's incentives to disclose information. And I do think here policies can be very helpful, including not just in the US, but in the EU, the AI Act requires a certain training data summary of what was used, of all the copyrighted sources that were used in the creation of the model.
Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's hard to know. It would be great to have more information about what training data is being used. It's hard to know how to incentivize people to release that information, or what a release of that information would look like. One way to incentivize that is you just absolve people from any legal responsibility for training on web scrape data, and then they don't have any risk because they release it, right? But that seems like a little bit too generous. I mean, yeah, the EU has taken this approach where they're trying to, mandate that there has to be disclosures.
But only for high-risk systems.
Yeah,
And
but then
so,
it becomes unclear who they're mandating that for, right?
yeah.
It's also not clear what it means to disclose what's in your training data. Would a high-level description of how the data was obtained suffice? Or does it need to be more detailed than that? Because your training data might be, so you started with a huge common crawl scrape, and then you did a whole bunch of different filtering, and you did some auditing, and you did more filters and auditing and more filters. And at some point, the only way to really disclose clearly what's in your training data set is just to disclose the entire training data set, right? but that is something that potentially has a lot of financial value. There are entire firms whose job it is to just create data sets or curate data sets. And if a company has spent tens of millions of dollars creating their data set, it seems sort of undesirable that they should have to publicly release that, right? So I think this issue of like saying that data sets you should publicly disclose what's in the data set, it's a much murkier issue than it's made out to be sometimes. It's not clear what such a disclosure would be. It's not clear whether it's even wise to ask people to disclose information. There may be situations where people's data sets contain things like PII, at least for certain proprietary products, that you wouldn't want to be disclosed, right? So I think that I think the approach the EU has taken is probably a bit oversimplified, and the approach that the US has taken is non-existent. And I think there's probably ways to do this that are more nuanced and more industry specific. But I think this is just it's not such a black and white thing to me, whether we should ask for disclosures or not ask for disclosures. I think it's complicated.
Okay, what are your thoughts on the regulation of open source AI projects, and how does that relate to utilization of AI in science?
Oof, that's a fantastic question, and lots of thoughts, specifically because we were very close to a regime where open source AI projects or open source AI models might have been heavily regulated or even licensed. So I think one of the reasons why people have been focused on this question of open source was precisely the fact that, these studies claim that open source AI can lead to bioweapon attacks, hacking critical cybersecurity infrastructure, creating all sorts of mis and disinformation, and so on. And in doing that, what policymakers didn't reckon with was that, just the question of the marginal risk of these models. And when we do look at what the marginal risk of openness is today, at least compared to closed foundation models, what we find is essentially there's not that much additional risk incremental to existing models in a large number of domains that people are actually concerned about. Sure, there is additional risk in things like creating deepfakes. There, I think we do need regulation. But in general, when it comes to like open foundation models writ large, I think it's a much more murky picture, simply because while closed models, for instance, might have safeguards for certain kinds of users, it's really hard to tell when a model is being misused versus being used for a legitimate purpose. So let me give you an example. One of the things that people have been very concerned about with open models is cybersecurity risks. That is, people can find vulnerabilities in critical security infrastructure using language models at scale and use that to hack into this critical infra. But it turns out that finding vulnerabilities is not a misuse problem. In fact, depending on whether it's the defender who is trying to use language models to identify vulnerabilities or an attacker, the equation completely changes, right? Because you might be like a developer who's trying to look for issues in their own code and try to fix them before release. But the language model actually has no context, and the company even has very little context on whether you belong to a defender or whether you're a defender of the system, you're like working in cyber defense, or you're trying to hack into the system from the outside. And so for a closed model developer, if they want to prevent zero-day cybersecurity vulnerabilities from being found using language models, they essentially have to kneecap the model's abilities to respond to questions related to coding. So at that point, I mean, this is one example that I used to sort of illustrate that this is really a problem of dual use. Finding cybersecurity issues is not like a misuse of these language models. And for that very reason, it's not like open models would lead to any additional risk incurred. Similarly, for biology and protein folding models, you can use AlphaFold to develop drugs. You can also use a lot of these biological models to create pathogens. What we really need to do is focus on the layers where these harms are materializing. For cybersecurity, to use these models to find and fix bugs proactively by the defenses, and Google is actually doing that already at a large scale with tens of thousands of open repositories. For biosecurity, to incorporate AI and screening tools and so on.
Thank you so much for that answer. Tom, did you want to add anything?
No, I like what was said. I don't have anything to add.
Okay, one final question, and then we're going to let everybody go, which is, do you think that there's a way to align VC-funded companies which don't look at return on investment over decades with, you know, a more prudent approach to technology. Any thoughts on that? How do you align financial incentives with a more prudent approach?
Yeah, that's a very hard question, in part because of the nature of VC funding and like the power law of most VC returns. So, I mean, most VCs are not looking at their average investment to succeed. They're looking at like 1% of their average portfolio to succeed. You have entire VC firms being built on the success of PayPal, for instance. You have billions of dollars from that one investment, nothing, almost close to nothing from everything else. And that's completely fine. So in some sense, the structure of VC firms incentivizes risk-taking. I mean, I think it can be debated whether that's good or bad, but at least in some sense, I think it's hard to incentivize or change the incentives for VCs to take bets on an individual level that are more prudent. I think the structure incentivizes this sort of heavy risk-taking so that the returns on the head of the distribution are high and not that the average returns are high. I mean, there are ways to sort of change this. There are like nonprofit funded institutions that take this more prudent approach. There are academic institutions. There are also VCs that are mission driven. But in general, I think whether or not we agree, I think it's really hard to change that incentive.
Did you want to add anything, Tom?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to change those incentives. Right now, we have like a liability regime where investors don't necessarily bear the financial responsibility for the problems that they cause, right? An example would be something like Stable Diffusion. It was very unclear when Stable Diffusion was released whether or not, you know, what the legal implications were of using training data in the way that they did, especially because their data set was open. But I think the idea was that they put the product up and you see what happens. And if you get sued into oblivion, you just close your doors to your shop. And that's that, right? None of that liability passes through to the investors if there's, you know, you just declare bankruptcy and the company is over, right? And investors have this idea, VCs especially, that a very small percentage of their investments are going to pay off. Most of these things are going to go sideways and they'll declare bankruptcy, and that limits the financial liability, and that's that. Right. And that's one of the reasons why you see a lot of tech products being developed in a fast and oftentimes irresponsible way, is either they make money or they don't make money. And if they try to make a small initial investment as they can, if they don't make money, you declare bankruptcy and the financial liability ends there. And that's that. Right. And maybe having liability structured in this way is not very productive. Right. This is something that Silicon Valley has been very good at exploiting. There's pros and cons to structuring liability the way that we have, but I think that one of the cons is that it certainly incentivizes, you know, irresponsibly fast product development.
Oh gosh, that is so true. All right, I want to thank Sayash and Tom. I want to thank all of you for putting up with us with this webinar and the arrangements, which was not my best, let's say. So please accept my apologies. Let me thank our co-sponsors, and which are all on the invitation. There's a lot of them from the United States and Canada. And let me say our next webinar will be on a review of Biden administration AI policies, where we've gone and what's going to happen to them. I'm hoping to get an OSTP person, but we'll see. And so thank you so much, and we'll see you again next month, hopefully. Have a great Thanksgiving and rest of year if I don't see you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having me.